Hi guys, I know it's been a while since my last video, but I think I want to back it up a little bit from all the pressure balancing talk and actually get back to basics about the suspension movement, in particular peak velocity, displacement and damping force, and how those three are interlinked. I want to look at what actually happens when we hit a bump. I know there's still a lot of people out there that refer to certain situations as low speed or high speed, and whilst there is some correlation, suspension output is usually directly proportional to input. Now, what this means is we can hit a bump at walking pace and produce very low shaft velocities, or we can hit that same bump at a greater vehicle speed and produce much higher shaft velocities. Now, this is true for chassis movements as well. Obviously, braking harder and accelerating harder or hitting jump faces more aggressively will produce much higher shaft velocities. Because what this comes down to is actually the collision or the bump impulse along with your suspension system stiffness that will determine the suspension velocity for a given event. I know there's a lot of DIY tuners out there and they like to talk about things like trail chatter, roots and rocks, etc. And they'll refer to this as low speed movement. The reality is this is actually low displacement, high frequency movement, and what we're asking the suspension to do is make short, quick, successive displacements, and this is where pressure balancing is actually the most crucial. If we have a look at the screen now, we can see that force equals damping coefficient times velocity. It means as we increase the coefficient, and we also increase the force output for a given velocity. Also, if we increase the velocity, for a particular damping coefficient, we also increase the force output. So we can see that those are interlinked. Coming up shortly, we'll have my data logger. So fairly basic unit, just a linear potentiometer with a Arduino board. And so this is sampling 500 samples per second of suspension displacement versus time. And so what we can do is we can measure the suspension velocity in 2 millisecond increments, so we can actually measure the rate of acceleration at what position we produce peak velocity. So really crucial tool. Not something you want to race on, but good. You can do full sessions, single events, anything like that. So coming up, we'll have some raw numbers. Obviously, the larger numbers will represent the time in milliseconds, so it keeps a tally of the time. The smaller numbers will represent the displacement in millimeters. So this is for the same event for two different fork configurations. One's the one that I currently race on, and the other fork, the blue fork, we added 0.3 mil float to. Obviously that blue fork's a softer fork, but we can see for the ski jump we had the same displacement for both forks, but we can see a lot of hysteresis in blue with that big flat hang up at full displacement. And you can see that blue takes a while to get going as well. And so what we can do is we can break that down even further. Like I say, we've got 2 millisecond intervals, and so we can trace velocity at each point. We can see here orange fork produces 5.24 meters per second at 47 mil of displacement. That's its peak velocity. Whereas blue, obviously a much softer fork, produces a peak velocity of 9.05 meters per second, but it does this at 119 mil of displacement, so further into the stroke. What this also means is that blue fork has substantially less displacement to slow down from that peak velocity. So coming up, we'll be able to plot that velocity, and we can see blue fork is indeed producing much higher velocity and much further into the stroke. Now we can use these velocity numbers along with our dyno results when we send them away to get them dynoed, and we know that blue fork is producing 13 kilograms of force per meter per second. Orange fork's producing 21 kilograms per meter per second. But when we plot those out relative to the velocity, we see the big difference between the two fork configurations. So orange fork doing the bulk of the work very early in the stroke, and as the spring force ramps up, the damping force actually drops off, whereas blue was doing the opposite. Now this is a single event, so this is a 100 by 100 block. All of these runs were on orange fork, just at different vehicle velocities. So I just keep increasing the speed, and we can see, like I said earlier in the video, that as you hit the same bump at a lower vehicle velocity, you'll also produce a lower suspension velocity. Not only do we produce a lower velocity, but we also had less displacement, obviously, and we can see a big difference in the rate of acceleration for the fork between the same setup but just different vehicle velocity. So I think people need to keep this in mind when they go about tuning their suspension. If we can work out what's actually happening in the fork and then tie that back into the whole pressure balancing and why pressure balancing is so crucial. There's a lot of research papers out there, and they'll tell you that as you bring that damping coefficient up, you'll actually bring forward peak velocity, so you'll bring it forward earlier in the stroke, and more to the point, the better pressure balance it is, the more forward you will bring that peak velocity. So there you have it, guys. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.